I wanted to welcome Elizabeth Wetmore, who goes by Beth. So if I'm feeling particularly formal, I might say Ms. Wetmore. But if things go really well, I might use first name. Thank you so much for coming. I know that this is just about a month after we were supposed to have our in-store conversation with Rebecca Mackay, and then so many things changed. I am Rebecca Mackay for the day, which is an amazing honor. So welcome. I would love for you to start out with sort of an elevator pitch about the book and then read a little.
Oh, that's right. I totally forgot about the elevator pitch. You told me this afternoon. So this is Valentine, and thank you so much for joining us. I was so looking forward to being in your beautiful bookstore in person, and so sad that I wasn't able to, but this is the next best thing, and I'm so glad to be here. Before I do the elevator pitch, I actually would just like to say that, you know, as someone who's kind of first generation college student and someone who did not go directly to college, I got out of high school and left Texas and went to the West Coast and started waiting tables. So I didn't go directly to college. And so for several years there, you know, librarians and independent booksellers were my academic advisors, you know, and my teachers. And so, you know, as a girl who grew up in Texas in the 70s and 80s, you know, I could walk into an independent bookstore and say, I read this book called Sula, and have the independent bookseller, you know, turn me on to 5 other books. So thank you for the work you do. And I'm really incredibly delighted to be here. So, so Valentine is set in West Texas in 1976, and it chronicles the story of the aftermath of a vicious assault on a 14-year-old Mexican-American girl, and is told from the alternating points of view of her and other women and girls in this community, this oil field community. And it sort of follows their stories up to in the months leading up to the trial and in the days immediately afterward. The characters are, some of the characters are, of course, Glory Ramirez, the young woman who opens and closes the book, and Mary Rose Whitehead, a young mother whose ranch is the place that Glory goes when she needs help. There's an old widow named Corinne Shepherd, who is kind of suffering through the loss of her husband, and has sort of made up her mind that she's going to sort of drink and smoke herself into an early grave. And then a young girl of 10 whose name is Deborah Ann Pierce, who is sort of running wild through the neighborhood as the summer progresses. So that's you know, that's my elevator pitch. If with your permission, I'll read a little tiny bit so y'all can hear the you know, a little of the voice of the story, I guess. This is from very late in the book. This is Carla's chapter. And don't worry, I'll only read for about 2 minutes. So we lose the men when they try to beat the train and their pickup trucks stall on the tracks, or they get drunk and accidentally shoot themselves, or they get drunk and climb the water tower and fall 10 stories to their deaths. During cutting season, when they stumble in the chute and a bull calf roars and kicks them in the heart. On fishing trips, when they drown in the lake or fall asleep at the wheel on the drive home. Pile up on the interstate, shooting at the Dixie Motel, hydrogen sulfide leak outside Gardendale. Looks like somebody came down with a fatal case of the stupid, Evelyn says when one of the regulars shares the news at happy hour. Those are the usual ways, the ordinary days. But now it is the 1st of September and the Bone Spring shale is coming back into play. Now we will also lose them to crystal and coke and painkillers. We will lose them to slipped drill bits or unsecured stacks of pipeline or fires caused by vapor clouds. And the women, how do we lose them? Usually, it's when one of the men kills them. In the spring of 1962, just after natural gas fields were discovered out near Wink, Evelyn likes to tell new hires, one of her waitresses clocked out, rolled up her apron, and carried it with her into the bar to knock back a few with the regulars. The woman's car was still in the parking lot when Evelyn locked up that night, and it sat there for nearly a week before they found her body. At an abandoned oil lease, Evelyn says, because that's where you always find the bodies. Bastard set her on fire, too. You don't get used to knowing something like that. Evelyn is small and wound tight with forearms like Sissel and a beehive the color of ripe plums. The next gas fields will be even bigger than Wink, she tells us at the weekly staff meeting. Start your engines, gals. Get ready to make bank. Keep your eyes peeled for the next serial killer.
Oh, just beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just love the voices. There's so much to talk about. Time, place, voice, time. Let's go with place first. Okay. Texas. Texas is a big state. This novel it's such a big state that I think we don't even realize the nuances of the different parts of it. Mm-hmm. And you have really brought West Texas to life. Talk a little about Texas as a character and how you were inspired.
Well, I grew up there, and when I left at 18, I didn't think of myself as a writer for many years, and when I did begin to think of myself as a writer, by which I mean I began to write, I never imagined that I would set anything in my hometown, and in fact didn't want to. And there came a time when I understood that the voices of the women and girls I had been hearing my whole life as a little girl growing up there were not going to leave me alone until I wrote the book, I guess is probably the best way to put it. And so, but it was but I had very complicated relationship with my hometown, and the way that I found my way back to having the kind of love and compassion and expansiveness of heart that's required to write a novel, because a novel really is a love letter, right? Whether it's to your hometown or the people who live there or an idea. The way I got there was by taking long drives through the desert every time I went to visit family. And so I would leave in the morning with a sandwich in my father's pickup truck, and sometimes not come back until midnight. And so it was by first kind of falling back in love with the land around those oil fields that I kind of fell back in love with my hometown and was able to write the book.
We were talking about you've been compared to Larry McMurtry. You've been compared to clearly. I read the book and I said, this woman likes Cormac McCarthy, not because of the spare style, but also because of lack of quotation marks, which very impressive that you got that through. I've heard from other authors that their editors would not let them take out the quotation marks. I love it. I just think I can sometimes complain about dialogue, but it was just, your dialogue is just so smooth, and once again captures the place so much. You sort of clearly love a Cormac, but you've kind of righted some wrongs by giving these women voices. I've heard that the story morphed a little and you made that a little stronger. Talk a little about how the story changed.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say those comparisons are not even remotely deserved. But that being said, they may not be deserved, but I'm very happy that my book is out there in the world, and I would very much like to be invited to the cookout. The West Texas Literature Cookout. So, but yeah, so, when I began writing the book, because West Texas is really built, on oil, the economy of the town, lives and dies by the oil field and the price of oil. And because I was interested in the blue collar part of that, the men and women who work in the oil patch, it was very hard for me to imagine writing this book without having male points of view, in part because there are so few women who actually work as roughnecks, even now. And in 1976, that was even more true. So most women in my hometown worked in, sort of accessory industries. They were waitresses and bartenders, preschool teachers, that sort of thing. And the men worked in the oil patch, so it's and I knew that the economy was incredibly important to me. And so so I couldn't imagine writing the book without having those male points of view. And I did. I had three chapters told from the points of view of men. And one of those became Corinne's point of view. I originally had written her sections from her husband Potter's point of view. And those became her chapters. And then the other two I wrote out, and it was hard. I tend to be, well, first of all, I'm just slow as molasses. I worked 14 years on this book, on and off. To be fair, I took long breaks from it. I raised my kid, I worked, the stuff of life. But I'm also a writer who can spend an entire morning working on a single paragraph and then throw it out and start all over again, So to have worked so hard for those points of view and those chapters, and then to kind of just pluck them out of there, was heartbreaking. But I think it was the right choice. And of course, in addition to realizing I could tell the story without male points of view, including the economy, and the other thing that happened over the course of many drafts was I came to feel the urgency of allowing these women and these girls to have this book in its entirety, for theirs to be, the only voices that were really heard. So.
Wow, just great. I want to talk a little about a time too, because this book it's set during an oil boom in the 1970s, 76 to be exact, and you really capture the time. It's like a time machine. You go back there. First of all, congrats on that. And secondly, was that all memory? Did you do some research? Did you?
Yeah.
No. Oh, go tell.
No, it was not memory. Although I was about the same age as those little girls on Larkspur Lane. I was about Deborah Ann Pierce's age in 1976, and I was an avid reader, and I was also an avid eavesdropper. So I spent a lot of time, listening to my mom and her girlfriends, smoking cigarettes and drinking Bloody Marys on the back porch after dinner and talking about their lives. And I think a lot of that stuck with me. I think that's part of the reason it's so voice heavy in a lot of ways, because I'm always, as a writer, I'm always listening. I'm always reading aloud. You'll never see me writing in the corner of a coffee shop, like, ever. And so, I had grown up in that part of the world, and Larkspur Lane is very much modeled on the street where I grew up. So much so that when my dad read the book, he recognized the street immediately. Now the characters are fictional characters, but the street was very real. And I stole that kind of part and parcel from my childhood. But when I did begin reading the book, of course, I realized in very short order that, I had seen such a tiny little sliver of my hometown, particularly as a young white girl growing up in a deeply segregated community. There was so much of my hometown that I knew nothing about. For example, until I began doing research, I don't think I had ever really understood and grappled with how much violence, particularly against women and girls, comes to town along with that oil boom. And when I started getting into the newspapers, and looking at those, I was just blown away at the kind of precipitous rise in crime, particularly violent crime against women and girls, that begins, when there's an oil boom. And of course, I had memories of, being told to be careful and, blah, blah, blah. But it was, it was something that I really missed as a little girl. And similarly, it wasn't until I was probably in high school that I really began to understand, the sort of the poison of racism that really infected every part of my hometown, and that was something that was new to me as I was writing the book. So a little bit of research and a whole lot of talking to people, and a lot of mining for memory, and then just, 1,000 drafts. So.
That's the thing about this book, is it's set in the 70s, but it's so timely. I mean, for one thing, the story there's sort of, to my thought, with all the different voices, there's really two plot lines, parallel plot lines that then explode together. I'm not going to give away what they are, but if you like that kind of book, this is for you. But one of the story obviously starts with the sexual assault of a teenage Mexican American girl, Gloria Ramirez. And I love that Robin Young called the book Glorious. But did she mean glorious, Glorius, or did she mean Gloria apostrophe S? So the world will never know. So she was doing radio puns. I love, so there's so much, there's this sexism just is through this story, the racism in terms of had Gloria been a white girl, how would the town have reacted? And then, of course, the environmental devastation caused by the oil industry. I mean, this, in a way, this book could have been set in many ways now.
Sure.
Were you thinking about all those things when you wrote it? And did you know that those would be like 1, 2, 3, the most important things that we were talking about right now?
Yeah.
14 years ago?
I did not. And of course, one of the things that happens, right, when you work on a book for that long is the world changes and you change, right? When I began this book, I imagined that it would mostly be told from the point of view of everyone, but I thought that the little girls would take a much more central role, and part of that, again, was because that was my age. And so, it was familiar terrain. And one of the things that happened after several drafts and pretty deeply into the book was I became a mother, and that changed everything about the way I saw those women who lived on Larkspur Lane. I suddenly had so much more empathy and compassion for their lives and for how hard they struggled, and how much they loved their daughters. I mean, it was just I know that there are a lot of people who are a lot of writers who are brilliant and compassionate and large-hearted at the age of 24. I was not that writer. I've had to learn everything, in through the course of my life, so that was a big change. The women just sort of took off, once that happened. The racism, I understood very early in the process that I could not write this book without at least attempting to grapple with the racism that I saw, as a girl growing up. And again, I was a witness to it, right? I didn't experience it. And so that's, a crucial difference. And the environmental devastation part of it was something that just came along, as I was doing my research. The truth is that West Texas has been sort of a slow rolling environmental disaster since, the Pinwell blew in 1918. That environmental devastation has really been picking up steam in recent years because of horizontal drilling and fracking. And yet, when my friends here in Chicago talk about, the evils of the oil industry, they are often talking about big oil companies, right? Or drilling off the coast of California. And I was very interested in, the men and women who feel those effects most keenly and immediately because they live there. And also, the very complicated nature of a town built where, the entire economy depends upon this, right? So when we're talking about, we need to move past fossil fuels, I mean, that's absolutely true. Of course it is, and at the same time, you have to grapple with the men and women who have built and whose lives depend, on this industry, and who suffer, from it in terms of health effects and otherwise, so that was something that sort of came along slowly. And I think it also happened because I took those long drives through the desert. And there came a moment, where I found myself feeling a little more committed as a writer to trying to encourage readers who didn't know that place, because it is terribly isolated, and there aren't, you really don't happen through Odessa, and there came a moment where I really kind of hoped that readers would see that part of the country as a place worth saving, in the same way that we see the coast of California as a place worth saving, or, the Alaskan refuge. The Chihuahuan Desert is remarkable and quite fragile, actually, and you don't have to drive too far out of my hometown before those oil derricks fall away and you're in some truly spectacular desert. So
I think, did you mention that there was actually, when you were driving through, that there was now at least one wind farm there? Did I
Yes,
pick that up? Yeah.
yes, there have started to be some wind farms, you know, and the truth is that, you know, when in the post-fossil fuel era, and it will happen, it's inevitable, when that happens, you'll see the population of a place like Odessa probably shrink drastically, you know, because it just simply can't, you know, support, you know, that kind of population. I think there are 90 to 100,000 people living in Odessa and about 85 to 90,000 people living in Midland, 22 miles away. You know, so, but yeah, there's, I mean, there, and of course, there's also that kind of argument that, you know, it wouldn't be the worst thing, right, to just leave some places alone and let them heal, you know, that there are, you know, that there are parts of the country, there are parts of the world that, you know, it would be perfectly okay to say, you know, we're just going to leave it alone for a few generations, you know, see what happens. So.
Oh, if only we could leave it alone and not say just dump our garbage there or something. One of the things, yes, several of the other women took over the story, but Deborah Ann, one of the young girls, and the younger person who might have been the person closer to your age, is a superstar of the book. I mean, her character and voice shine very brightly. As somebody said, if you like a book with a scout in it, a To Kill a Mockingbird type scout in it, you know, here's a book for you. And it is true. She is just delightful and fascinating, and her friendship with Jesse, the homeless, I guess you would say, veteran, it really does a wonderful counterpoint to the other story. Were you thinking about, like, how were you thinking of balancing it, and how did you get hurt? Is that character close to you at all? Is it, you know?
Well, yeah, you know, all of the characters have a bit, you know, a bit of me, and all of them. I've joked that I'm so thankful that we did not sell the book after the third or fourth draft, you know, because it really would have been a horrible book and deeply autobiographical. But draft by draft, it became, you know, fiction, and these characters became, you know, sort of fully developed in their own right. But Deborah Ann, I stole a few things from myself for her, including, you know, her love of the bookmobile, which really changed my life. The best day of my life still to this, well, okay, maybe the 5 best days of my life were getting my driver's license, because that's huge in that part of the world, having my son, marrying my husband, and selling the book was pretty great. And the day it came out was pretty great. But the other one was the day that the bookmobile, you know, that they drove up with a flatbed pickup truck, or flatbed truck, and pulled the bookmobile onto a gravel lot that was about 2.5 blocks from the house where I grew up, because it meant I didn't have to wait for anyone to take me to the library. I could just bike over there and check out all the books I wanted. And so some of those things I stole, you know, pretty heavily from my childhood, and that freedom of movement, you know, when you're a kid of that age, particularly in the 70s, you know, kind of the ability to get up and just disappear for hours at a time, which is something even now I kind of long for sometimes. So.
And kids nowadays don't always have that. I wanted to shout out to Paulette, our retired librarian friend in Indiana, who wrote DA and her bookmobile rule. Love the character. So we book lovers have a special place in our heart for bookmobiles. There was one that used to go stop at my elementary school. And when I went to visit Parnassus, I know Ann Patchett wrote a wonderful quote for your book. The definition of a stunning debut, and Parnassus, of course, had Parnassus on Wheels. They actually have a bookmobile that I did get. I really drove 12 hours so I could tour the bookmobile. So, you know, we love that, how you were able to incorporate that memory certainly into it. I'm sure it made many people love that book even more.
I can't imagine how many people's lives have been changed, by the presence of those rolling libraries. I think about that a lot. I mean, I can't imagine how my life would be different if it hadn't, sort of showed up. So, yeah.
There's no question. I mean, books, I can't tell you how many people have said, both in their books and in person to me, books saved my life.
Yeah.
And that was a way pre-internet that we could all get those books. So yeah, so cool. I wanted to talk to you about some of the changes you made in the book. You mentioned once that this is a pretty self-contained story time-wise, but you said once that the book spanned many more years. Talk a little about that change and why you made it.
Right. Well, in retrospect, I guess I should start by saying that the short story is really the form that I most love and most passionate about. I really consider the short story to be kind of the jazz of American letters. I mean, it's just, first of all, it's a form that Americans have really, really run with, I think, and it's the form that I feel most comfortable with. So in retrospect, I don't know why I would think that spanning 11 years in a single book would have worked for me, because I tend to take such a focused, approach. But yeah, in a couple of the early drafts, the story spanned about 11 years. It began in 1976 and ended in 1987. And so the girls were the young girls were teenagers, young women. And I plucked about, I guess it was about the fourth or fifth draft of the book, I plucked about 25 pages out and set everything else aside, and began again with those 25 pages. And that was the book that became Valentine.
Yeah, do any of these, we were talking about how when you were saying sometimes when you teach, you don't like to write novel excerpts, but so many of these chapters do stand on their own. Were any of them actually meant to be stories in this book?
A couple of them were actually published as short stories, and there was a fleeting moment before I realized that I really did want to tie all their stories together. There was a fleeting moment when I imagined this as a collection of linked stories, and I did realize that one of the advantages of a novel, I think, is that it does give you a little bit more wiggle room. The short story form is so tight and perfect, and there's really not a bit of wiggle room for a word to spare. And I love that about the short story form. But I for this particular book, I kind of long to sort of meander a bit. And to have a little space to wander. And I think, you see that there's a lot of wandering in that book. But yeah, so I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
I just asked if any of the chapters actually had been stories, and you said yes.
Yes, two of them. Jenny's chapter and the first two chapters, Mary, Rose, and Glory. That was one short story. And that was the other thing that happened was after it came out as a short story, I realized that there was more to tell, and I kept kind of mucking around with it. So
I'm sure I'm not giving anything away by someone along the line, perhaps an agent said, you could get 10 times as much money if this was a novel than a collection of short stories, but and more likely to sell it too. So.
Yeah, no one ever said that, but of course that became
it's implied.
That's been clear to me. I do enough reading and because I went to graduate school, I have a fair number of friends and acquaintances who are writers. So I understood that to be an unfortunate truth. Actually, yeah. I mean, I think it's a shame. Because I do think short stories can do. I'm not sure that there's anything that packs an emotional punch, as well as just a solid short story. So, but there it is.
Every 10 years.
Poetry doesn't sell either, and poetry is the best of like all the forms. So, I mean, poets are totally going to save the world, and you can't get any money for a poetry collection. So there it is.
I mean, it is so tied to, well, one of the things that's so tricky is our writing schools have to really teach people in stories because it's really hard to workshop a novel in progress. But that, right, once you get out, you're really, aside from getting tenure in academia, there's not much. There's, you can get a story in the New Yorker, but with the death of the popular magazine industry, which once there, you could have many a writer made their fortune selling short stories to Saturday Evening Post and Ladies Home Journal and Balls and Redbook. And it just, so, one day, if somebody's bored out there, they should go to their library, online library stuff and read wonderful old short stories, because they're different. They are different from the writing school stories. They do have a little more plot and a little more, they're just a little more, feel like a novel in some ways than the stories that come out in most collections nowadays. But I'm, like I said, this is the next best thing, because it sort of has the best of both. I've been reading a lot of Oklahoma books lately for some reason. So the states are contiguous. I think that's my transition. And there's a wonderful, to throw out this collection. I think it's billed as a novel, but you can tell that these were stories. It's a book called Crooked Hallelujah by Kelly Jo Ford. Oh, there it is.
I've got it right here. It's one of my favorite things about selling my book is I get to see things before they come out. It's a beautiful book. You've read it. You just finished it?
Yes, we're going to actually do a conversation with her on July 27th. It's not even on our calendar, so the people here are the first people to know. We wasn't even necessarily offered to us. I met her at the Winter Institute conference in January, and she was one of those things that all of you, if you ever go to a conference, you meet somebody like the first day, and then you run into them every 10 minutes for the rest of the conference, and all these people you never see, or you maybe see once. And she was my magic twin or something like that. And I was like, oh, I have to read your book now, and it's amazing. So
yeah, it's great. I met her at Winter Institute as well. Although I only met her the one time, but she's a lovely woman, and the book is just really, really going to set the world on fire, I think. So
you couldn't run into her that much because she was always with me. I was also reminded of, I just read Sam Anderson's Boomtown, The History of Oklahoma City, and it reminded me of, because they've also have this oil history and now are dealing with fracking and all the earthquakes that result from it.
Right.
One of the things, but enough about, I think we'll talk about books. I think we'll talk about books more later. I saw that you were on one of your interviews that you're a big fan of News of the World. Another wonderful Texas novel.
Yes, I love that book. It's Paulette Giles man. She's a national treasure, and she's sure a Texas treasure too. So I don't think she's gotten nearly. I don't think she's gotten nearly as much due as she deserves as a writer. I think I've read all of her books. So yeah.
Well, Sam, the Fiddler, I think, just came out, but News of the World was one that I worked with a couple of other booksellers, and we just couldn't stop selling it. It's it's such and a very Texas novel.
Yeah.
I also saw, I think I on one of your interviews, I saw True Grit on your bookshelf.
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow I managed to go my whole life without reading True Grit until the man died a few months ago, and it is wonderful. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. I mean, it came out in 1968, and so, the way we see the world has changed pretty significantly, between 1968 and now, and there are a few moments where you feel that as a reader, I think, but on the whole, I think it's beautifully written. I mean, he does such a good job of telling a story from the point of view of a young girl. I mean, it's a remarkable book. So I just love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Needs a little in context. But still a great book. I wanted to ask you, let's see if I have any more questions. It's a tough thing, you have a few male characters. There's, needless to say, the center of the story in terms of Dale Strickland is a terrible character. And the voices are women, but there are some. The Jesse is a wonderful character. The Uncle Victor is a wonderful character. So how did you sort of try to balance sort of the good and the evil, and sort of try to find the nuance in different people? I think even in your narrators, I think Suzanne, one of the neighbors. Talk a little about Suzanne. It's a character I bet you had to kind of learn to love.
Yeah, Suzanne was probably the hardest character for me, in part because she's just so different from me. She's a character who's kind of towed the line her whole life, and is sort of always there, sort of one of those, in a lot of ways, kind of the character in the book who would most, who would most obviously be that sort of, stereotypical, sort of Southern woman, always baking, always delivering casseroles. I don't ever think about, how to, I don't really think of much in terms of balancing the good and the evil of the book. But I do think a lot in terms of making my characters real, as real as possible. And fictional characters, like people, are complicated, and they're contradictory. And so with Suzanne, for example, finally the way I got into her was, I had this moment where I was trying to work on her chapter, and so much so I almost gave it up, actually. That chapter came that close to not making it into this book. And even now, there are moments where I'm like, but there was a moment when I was really trying to find a way to get into her, and to see her a little more sympathetically. And two things happened. I started thinking about her family and where she was from, and what her childhood had been like. And suddenly that explained so much more about who she was in the book. But the other thing was, I actually just had this moment where I was like, you can make fun of a character for, delivering a bunch of casseroles, but the truth is Suzanne's casseroles fed like a lot of characters in this book. So, judge her all you want, but her character, her casseroles were all over that street, so yeah.
Well, she did.
And then with Jesse and some of the other men in the book, I have a real soft spot for veterans. And I became very interested in, as I was writing in the book, in the 70s, one of the things that happened in my hometown was a whole bunch of young men came back from the Vietnam War and went back to their hometowns, and couldn't make a living. And so they came to Odessa, to try to work in the oil patch. And these were young men who, had all kinds of trauma from the war that was unresolved, right? And I found myself meditating a lot on the reality of surviving a war only to come home and go to work in a truly dangerous industry that, where things might blow any moment. And my dad was actually like that. My dad came home from Vietnam and went to work at the petrochemical plant in my hometown, where he worked for 30 years, and he worked in safety. So I have very clear memories of him getting up in the middle of the night when the plant whistle went off, and going out to, try to save a life, or frankly, to clean up the mess, right? And so I thought a lot about what it must be like to survive a war and then come home and spend the rest of your working life working in a dangerous and unpredictable industry, and loud, So, yeah.
Before we get to, we're going to get to questions. I thought I also wanted to mention that you had recommended Luis Alberto Urrea's House of Broken Angels.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like he might have written did he write a quote for you for the book, or?
He did not. I didn't have the nerve to ask. Maybe I should have. I had him at a workshop in Breadloaf, and he was so lovely. And of course, I love his work. He has such a tender and humane eye that he turns on virtually all of his characters. And actually, I just picked up The Devil's Highway. and read that. I was actually reading this as the Supreme Court case on DACA came down. This came out in 2004. And if you get it, it's one of those, it's a moral imperative books, just beautifully written, about a group of men who died in the desert in 2001, trying to cross, who got lost and abandoned by the people who they had, hired to take them. And I think 14 of them ended up dying. And so it's a recounting of that. If you do get it, I recommend reading the 2013 afterword, actually. And I never, ever recommend this, but in this case, I would recommend reading it before you read the book, because he updates it a little bit in ways that I think are important. But it's a beautiful book. Yeah, he's one of my heroes. I don't know if I've ever read a single thing of his that I didn't love.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, just so deeply humane, in every possible way, with every possible character, no matter how, unlikable they might be.
So we're gonna do questions, but somebody did ask a question on the chat, and it's funny because I asked that question before we started, which was, did the author have a chance to listen to the audiobook version of the novel? Now, it was truly amazing. And the answer is,
I have not listened to it yet. I've been so busy with the book, and also, I'm 52, and I think I might just be. Well, that's not true. Lots of people who are 52 listen to audiobooks. I think it's just a personal quirk. I've never quite made the adjustment to audiobooks, even on long trips, like even on long drives. I'll just listen to music the whole time, so no, I have not listened to it, but I've heard it's lovely, yeah, but I've not heard it yet. So
okay, I just want to say I just process listening different from my processing reading, but you have to tell our attendee the 2 mispronunciations in the audio.
Oh, well, I've heard this through the grapevine. I've heard that pecan is pronounced pecan, which is unfortunate because it's pecan. And then the town of Blanco, Texas, which everyone pronounces Blanco. I think the narrators pronounced it Blanco, but again, that's a pretty, a Texas accent is quirky. I mean, Texans do all kinds of crazy stuff with their accents. They add extra vowels in, extra syllables. They say height, right, instead of height, right? They add that th on the end. It's an accent that's actually starting to disappear as the demographics in Texas change and more people live in the cities. And really, when I go to my hometown now, I don't hear a whole lot of people under the age of 30 who have that, strong twang, right, that was so ubiquitous when I was a little girl. So I'll miss
in Wisconsin. Yeah.
So, the ability to stack like 3 prepositions up one after another in a sentence. So I'll miss that.
Do you have any other books that you would like to recommend to folks?
Oh, yes. So let's see here. Well, I've been reading a lot of poetry lately. I read a lot of poetry in general. But I picked up 3 that have really been meaningful to me. This one's called And More Black by Ty Freedom Ford. It comes off this little press, Augury Books. It's a beautiful book. And it just won some poetry prize that completely escapes me. And then I'm reading Jaswinder Balina's the 44th of July. I'm in the midst of that now. It's terrific. And then I'm reading Jericho Brown's The Tradition, which is, I had seen a few things of his anthologized, but I'd never read any of his books. And it's wonderful. Yeah, let's see here.
And that won the Pulitzer.
Joe Ford's book is coming out, right?
Oh, yeah.
Here's one that I actually love, and this one's set in Texas. I always feel like I should give a plug for a Texas writer. This one's called Where We Come From, Oscar Casares. It's set in Brownsville, and it came out in 2019. It came out last year, and it is, again, just one of those deeply humane, incredibly well-written books. it concerns a woman who's sort of always towed the family line and done what was expected of her, who finds herself faced with the decision of how to help a stranger who shows up at her door needing help, which in a lot of ways is like the most important question any of us will ever answer, right? Like, you know, what do you do, right, when the stranger knocks on your door and needs help? And so, yeah, it's just, it's really moving and feels really timely, particularly right now with everything that's going on the southern border. So.
That was one of the books that you recommended, and I actually sent a note to myself that I had to read that book immediately.
Yeah.
It just sounds spectacular.
Yeah, and then there's one that just came out like last week. I'm still in the thick of it, but this book, All Things Left Wild by James Wade, another Texas writer that I'm just making my way through, and I'm really enjoying. So, yeah, so many good books, so many good books. So
a wealth of literary delights in Texas.
Right.
We have a question from Paulette. Paulette, ask your question.
I was so impressed with this book in so many ways, and the courtroom scene with Mary Rose, amazing, outstanding. I loved her character. Yeah. But I was really touched by each woman having another woman come alongside of them. I mean, there was Mary Rose on her porch with her gun, which aimed Mrs. I forget. Anyway, the gun had a name and it was a woman.
Old lady.
Oh, and the lady poolside that came alongside of Glory, and Corinne came alongside of Mary Rose. It was so poignant. It's sort of like the community of women that I'm really glad you left the focus on. But and I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly, but the book starts with Gloria at sunrise, and the end of the book, I believe it's Glory and her uncle in the desert at night. And I love even the snake was a woman.
Yeah. It's actually, they cross the border at sunrise. So the book begins and ends with her, just after sunrise. But you're right. There's that pivotal moment when they're in the desert at night, too. I found myself, as I was working on this book, meditating a lot on how women who don't have a lot of means, a lot of money, or maybe a lot of education, or certainly a lot of power, how they find a way to support each other, and to survive, honestly. And that was something that was very much in my mind. Glory, of course, is different, right, from every other character in this book. Because she's a Latina, and one of the things that I thought a lot about was I tried to be very careful in the book not to really have the white women swoop in and save her. You'll notice that, and I did this quite intentionally, after that opening scene on Mary Rose's porch, Glory never appears in any scenes with any of the other women in the book ever again. And to me that felt very real and true, that her support and help would come from her uncle and her mother, before her mother, was taken from her. And so but that, and of course that moment with Tina is such a quiet and gentle moment. It's really one of my favorite moments in the book, because it served as a reminder to me that a lot of us don't really think of ourselves as particularly heroic, or our lives as particularly the stuff of heroism, and it's easy to forget that even the smallest act can have huge consequences. And it's also easy to forget that wherever you're from or whoever you are, there's always time to stand up and be, heroic. And so I thought about that a lot with these women. So I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
I loved it.
Thank you.
One of the things I didn't want to overplay the story aspect of the book. It has a very strong sense of drama and a real great through line. And as you said, the courtroom, there's it is carries you through the whole way, like the best novels. So just make it clear in that way. And I think Paulette definitely helped me and make that point. Do you have any other questions? Doesn't somebody want to ask about, well, we know that Beth writes not in coffee shops, but with the door closed, by herself. Do you have any other writing rituals?
Well, I'm going to tell you something. Right now, I'm looking for an office because I have written in the corner of the bedroom for about 5 years. We live in Chicago, so we're in a pretty small but super cute apartment. My husband and my 15-year-old son and me. Back before before the world changed so radically, the way my writing day went was I got up and everyone left. People went to school and to work, and then I holed up in the bedroom and got to work. But now everyone's home all the time. So I'm still in a corner of the bedroom. I turned my desk around when I started doing interviews. Normally it faces the wall, but I had this moment very early. I think it might have been like when I was getting ready for the Today Show, where like a second before we went on, I realized that this whole scene behind me was the bedroom with like my husband's underwear and the closet open, and I was like, this won't do it all. So I turned my desk around so I could have sort of a semi-professional kind of look, and I also, so I didn't have to like clean up the bedroom every time there was a thing happening. So in terms of writing tips, I mean, God, I think that I think one of the most damaging things that I ever heard in graduate school was that the writer is the person who writes every single day. And I think a lot of us come from places and have circumstances where that simply is not, possible. And I think it can be real disheartening, if you're taking care of young children or parents, or working 2 or 3 jobs, and you still have a longing to write, but you can't get there every single day. It can be easy to feel like, well, I'm not a real writer, or, if you reach a particular age, right, and you haven't sold your book. Something that I think a lot about is how every single bit of the life I lived, went into writing this book, and every bit of heart and soul I had, and I'm glad I didn't give up, because when you work on a book for that long and you have, pressures, right, to earn a living and take care of your kid, it can, and you reach a certain age, it can be really easy to feel like, this dream is over and I should set it aside. But the truth is we're all on our own trajectories, everyone is not a 27-year-old kid right out of the MFA program who signs a great book deal. Some of us take a lot longer to figure it out, frankly. And so I guess, this isn't like really a writing tip, I guess, but I guess, I think a lot about, all the times that I thought about giving up and how much it broke my heart every time I thought about giving up on these characters, and how glad I am that I reached a moment where I just simply didn't give a damn anymore about thinking about other people's trajectories. So, and then read aloud. That's my other piece of advice. Read your work aloud all the time, and read poetry. Fiction writers should be reading poetry like all the time. I'm absolutely convinced that reading poetry will make your fiction better, so much better. And if you can read other people's poetry aloud, all the better. So, so that's my advice. So.
One thing, you've been an inspiration just because, because
you're right. I'm sorry.
As you mentioned, first novel at 52, 14 years in the making. It just shows that tenacity, that you can, that there can be other things in your life besides writing, and you can still write. The publishing industry is not going to take everybody's book, but they're definitely looking for diverse voices right now, opportunities for people who might not have had the opportunity in the past. So that's just exciting.
Yeah.
So
sure.
yeah. Oh, what's your next writing project? Thanks, Beth.
Well, right now I'm working on short stories. And I've got a couple of collections of short stories, one set in Texas and one set in Phoenix, that are more or less complete. So I'm working on those, and just trying to do a little gentle revision. I wish I could say that I'm writing brilliant stuff in the midst of this pandemic. But most of the new stuff I'm writing right now is really just the longhand version of me rocking back and forth in the corner. What's going on? You know, in fact, I'm going through one of my journals. I picked up journals a few years ago when I had a nasty, nasty case of writer's block, one of those cases where you think it's over and done. I picked up a composition book and just started doodling in that, and it really took for me. So I do everything in my composition book. I'll at least start things in my composition book. So I've been going through my composition books from the last couple of months and trying to cull like the 10% of stuff in there that's ever going to become anything good. And by good, I mean fiction. And so I've been working on that a bit. And then I'm turning my eye toward the next book, that, you know, I talked about the book spanning 11 years. And I don't think I'm completely done with all of these characters, and I'm certainly not done with this place. So I think I'm starting to turn my eye toward the next novel, when the girls on Larkspur Lane, Deborah Ann Pierce and her cohort, are about 15 years old, which also coincides with that devastating bust in the 80s, that just completely just yanked the rug out from under everyone who lived in that part of the world or relied on that industry. So.
Well, we are looking forward to it. No pressure.
I'm hoping it doesn't take me 14 years. You know, the clock's ticking. So.
One day we'll have our author, who really just lives not just in Chicago, but really on the northern tip of Chicago, in the store for one of those traditional events that I don't even remember anymore. So, but for now, this is, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all of you, because we wouldn't have a bookstore without you, virtual or otherwise, and hope to see you at another event. Thank you so much.
Daniel, thank you so much for having me. Chris, thank you for your help, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, I can't wait. I'll come up and go to a Cubs game and stop by the bookstore. So yeah, thank you very much. Everyone take care.